So while today searching the stars for your future is harmless fun, it was a gravely serious matter in the 1600s. Practicing astrology could lead to accusations of witchcraft, for which a person found guilty could be hanged. At the time, people divided on astrology. Some saw it as a helpful science, or maybe a form of demonic conjuring. Others just viewed it as a way to con yokels. These three responses were all part of the witchcraft trial of Mark Prynn. In August of 1645, Great Yarmouth Corporation summoned the witchfinder Matthew Hopkins for discovering and finding out of witches, to make search for such wicked persons, if any be here. Prynn was brought before the Borough Sessions Court in September. He was accused of practicing sorcery by finding lost objects and using maleficia, or harmful magic, against the goldsmith John Howlett and his son. Now, the professionalization of popular magic, such as healing, divination, and counter-witchcraft, led historian Stuart Clark to argue that churches were probably right to think they were being challenged by a rival institution, standing in the way of complete pastoral hegemony. Astrologers and healers became vulnerable to elites seeking to cleanse their society during periods of political upheaval. And these reformers saw white magicians as witches and challenges to godly authority. The 1645 Great East Anglian Witch Hunt saw a concerted effort by urban communities to pursue witchcraft accusations against members of their own communities, and those trials reflect the differing contemporary attitudes to magic. Great Yarmouth was divided during the period. The town's economy was made up of fishermen and the industries that supplied them, and merchants who traded across the North Sea and beyond. It was largely strict Protestant or Puritan merchants who ran the town's governing corporation, meaning the governors had different interests to most of the town's residents, who showed more interest in protecting their fishing ships than the choice of minister. Members of the corporation sought to control the town's parish church and ministry, to the point of taking an active role in the 1645 witch hunt. Religious and political differences such as these influenced how an individual approached astrology. This talk starts with examples of acceptable forms of astrology in Great Yarmouth practiced by Mark Prynn. The talk then moves to show why Miles Corbet, the MP and regicide, prosecuted Mark Prynn in 1638. Finally, the talk looks at how Corbett once again supported allegations that Prynn was a conjurer in the 1645 witch hunt, but the minister Thomas Cheshire defended Prynn by portraying Prynn's astrology as a mere confidence trick. The 1645 witch hunt brought to the surface three visions of astrology in conflict with one another, pitting MP and astrologer against each other in a deadly feud. Astrology was an acceptable and commonplace part of many people's lives in Great Yarmouth during the first half of the 1600s. There was continued interest in astrology at the time. Reading the stars allowed the town's residents to gain certainty in their futures through almanacs, readings, and medical diagnoses. The Lilly family produced an almanac for the town continuously from the beginning of the century to the early 1660s. The publication of almanacs was supplemented by astrological readings. These were employed by the astrologers in helping residents seeking to recover lost property or as the basis for medical treatment. The success of even Mark Prynn's very amateur practice shows how popular astrology was amongst the town's citizens. Astrology had a place in the early modern cosmology as either white magic, art, or science, depending on who you asked. The first half of the 1660s, up until the British Civil Wars, was a golden age for astrologers, including Puritan ministers and doctors. The astrologer William Lilly was described as the first astrological republican during the Civil Wars, and he had been taught by the father of Great Yarmouth's Puritan minister, John Brinsley. During the British Civil Wars, both the royalist George Wharton and the parliamentarian William Lilly were producing rival almanacs, and the leading generals of the New Model Army consulted astrological predictions to inform their military strategy. Given that astrologers had national prestige and influence, their success in wealthy and well-connected Great Yarmouth was to be expected. The earliest report of astrology in Great Yarmouth is from a court case in the 1500s, in which one William Wycherley admitted that he did conjure at Yarmouth in the Great Circle with the sword and a ring consecrated, and that one Thomas Aldring of Yarmouth is a conjurer and have very good books of conjuring. The clearest evidence of the town's support for astrologers may be found in the Lilly family. Here we go there. Geoffrey Lilly started compiling annual almanacs in the town from 1604, in which he describes himself variously as a physician, a student of mathematics, and a gentleman. After his death in 1613, his nephew Geoffrey Lilly continued the almanacs. In 1626, the corporation dismissed Geoffrey from his political role in the town, so his cousin John Lilly took over writing from 1661. Almanacs were a popular and accessible form of astrology, where the astrologer laid out the year's predictions. They were sold unbound and on cheap paper, and often relied on dynastic astrologers to maintain a readership. The publishing of the Lilly's almanac for over half a century showed the continuing popularity of almanac astrology as a handy guide to life. Now, unlike the Lilly's, Mark Prynn was an amateur astrologer who used his astrological skills to supplement his income. While little information survives on Prynn's family and background, we know that he was an educated man and practiced astrology as a tool for finding lost objects and for medical treatment. Prynn was notable for his collection of theological, historical, and philosophical books. His skill was ascribed to his use of Molson's Almanac, a brief of that famed Fabulous Shepherds, a 15th century almanac that provided guidance on astrology and a book of circles. Local residents employed Prynn to find lost objects such as hats and pillows, or according to the satirist John Taylor, lost cow, calf, horse or carts, or silver spoon, or bodkin knife, or ring, or millstone, windmill, cork. His astrological skills were also applied to medicine, and the corporation recorded paying him 30 shillings in 1645 for curing one Tills, a distracted man in Bridewell, of the malady which was upon him. Prynn's medical treatment was comparable to astrological medical practitioners such as Geoffrey Lilly, Richard Napier, and Simon Forman, and effective enough for him to be paid handsomely. Thus, while Prynn was an amateur, he provided a skill that was in demand not only from local residents, but also the godly Great Yarmouth Corporation. Great Yarmouth's astrologers were able to make a living in the town from their predictions. Writing almanacs, providing astrological readings, and performing medical care provided enough income to support the Lilly's and Mark Prynn. The almanacs were able to survive the vicissitudes of the British Civil Wars by virtue of their profitability and popularity, and they continued right the way to the Restoration. People in the area trusted Mark Prynn, and so did the local corporation. Astrology was a normal part of people's lives, conducted by respected individuals within Great Yarmouth. However, the town's astrologers, court patronage, and ties to the town's conformist minister left them vulnerable to growing fears of witchcraft, as Prynn would soon discover. In 1638, the town's government brought Mark Prynn before the borough court due to accusations he was using harmful magic. The town's strict Puritan recorder and MP Miles Corbet sought to use Prynn's astrological knowledge as evidence of his use of damnable magic. It was Miles Corbet's Puritanism that had brought him into conflict with the amateur astrologer. Prynn was a tenant of the town's conformist minister, Matthew Brooks, who had challenged Miles Corbet over his support for Puritan nonconformity. Corbet's prosecution of Prynn was a Puritan attempt to cleanse Great Yarmouth of magical beliefs previously thought acceptable. By 1638, Great Yarmouth was dominated by a group of truculent Puritans who made up much of the town's governing corporation. Puritans sought a purer faith based on the Bible alone, opposing the domination of the Church of England by the Laudian clergy, seeking to make the church more decorative and ceremonial. The town's minister, Matthew Brooks, had pushed through a series of Laudian reforms to the town's church since 1635, including moving the pulpit and adding stained glass to the church. Brooks's militant support for Laudianism polarized the town's citizens, leading to tension between the ministry and the town's corporation. Now, Miles Corbet was the second son of Sir John Corbett, a baronet from Sprowston. He matriculated at Christ College, Cambridge in 1612 and attended Lincoln's Inn in 1615 and was finally called before the bar in 1623. Corbett became Great Yarmouth recorder in 1625, a role that encompassed town clerk, legal expert and judge. He also undertook this role for King's Lynn and Aldborough corporations. He was chosen as one of the town's MPs for parliaments between 1628 and 1660 and became one of the regicides in 1649 when he signed Charles I's death warrant. Corbett had highly reformed religious sensibilities and showed support for both the town's Puritan elite and to more radical congregationalists in the Netherlands and Great Yarmouth. Corbett was accused during the British Civil Wars of being a most stiff cathedral hater, a utopian of no religion, and whose fired zeal led to his cruelty to toothless, aged ministers. It was his godly faith that led him to pursue Mark Prynn through the town's courts. In January 1638, Prynn faced charges in the town's toll house of using charms to locate goods lost by one sailor called John Spark. The toll house was the town's jail and court and was situated to the southwest of Yarmouth, overlooking the haven and the main trading quays. It was a building that sought authority and control, and the power of the town's corporation was represented symbolically through the control of space. Its ground floor acted as the town's jail, and on the day of their trial, the accused were dragged from their cells in the first floor court. Corbett, as recorder, sat on an impressive chair overlooking the court on a raised dais. The officers of the court were also drawn from members of the town's Puritan elite, giving a friendly audience to Corbett's arguments against Prynn. According to the poet John Taylor, Corbett had no proof but a book of circles found in Prynn's study, which Miles said was a book of conjuring. The book of circles Corbett referred to was an old almanac, likely the Greater and Lesser Keys of Solomon. The connection made between astrology and witchcraft was nothing new. The contemporary astrologer John Gadbury had blamed pretenders for connecting astrologers to magicians and necromancers. William Lilly had rejected the dark sentences of oracles being put on astrologers. Corbett sought to argue that Prynn's power to predict the future came from conjuring spirits rather than astrology. Corbett was alleged to have believed that the use of astrological terms was a means of summoning demons, making it damnable and dangerous. The demonic connections Corbett made was especially dangerous for Prynn. Conjuring made astrology a crime punishable by death. In 1645, Prynn was also accused of practicing sorcery by finding lost objects, but also the crime of harmful magic against the goldsmith John Howland and his son, as well as consorting with spirits. The 1563 Witchcraft Act stated that the use, practice, or exercise of any witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery, whereby any person should happen to be killed or destroyed, was a crime worthy of capital punishment. Therefore, allegations sought to prove that those accused had used harms using malus diabolicus arts, witchcraft in English. Prynn was accused under the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which added the practice or exercise of any invocation or conjuration of any evil and wicked spirits to or for any intent or purpose as a felony also worthy of death. There were further accusations specifically against Mark Prynn that his use of charms, incantations, and sorceries were criminal. It was also criminal that his customer John Sparks travelled south to the nearby town of Galston in search of a felt hat due to Prynn's advice. These accusations were deadly serious, and again, if Prynn was convicted, he would be hanged. So the accusations against Prynn were in part a response to his close connection to the Laudian minister Matthew Brooks. Brooks had granted Prynn tenancy over some church land. Now, Brooks had struggled against the town's Puritans since his arrival in Great Yarmouth in 1630. In December of 1631, Brooks had marched into the town's church and read the 1627 injunctions against the Puritan minister John Brinsley, leading to Brooks's arrest by members of the town's corporation, including Miles Corbett. In January of 1632, Brooks sent a petition against Brinsley to King Charles I. When it was brought before the king in March of that year, the king sided with Brooks and ordered the Puritans' dismissal and the arrest of those who had themselves arrested Brooks, once again including Corbett. In 1637, their feud deepened as Brooks attacked Corbett for harbouring two emigre nonconformist ministers smuggling illegal pamphlets into the town. This conflict between Corbett and Brooks made Corbett willing to see Prynn as a spiritual threat. Miles Corbett's prosecution of Mark Prynn shows how astrology had a complex place in Puritan understanding. Corbett connected astrology to conjuring by alleging that Prynn's esoteric knowledge was evidence of communing with demons. Prynn's practice of using astrology for the discovery of lost items was the initial source of the accusation, but Corbett felt that the knowledge contained within Prynn's almanac was the strongest evidence that Prynn was conjuring. Corbett's support for the accusations was grounded in fears that royal court-connected individuals were corrupted. Despite Corbett's position and his deployment of the evidence of the almanac, the town's conformist ministers rescued Prynn from prosecution, as the jury found Corbett unconvincing. However, in 1645, Corbett would once more attempt to convict Prynn as a witch, this time during a witch panic. The goldsmith John Howlett accused Mark Prynn on the 22nd of April 1645 of bewitching Howlett and his son, also named John. This was just part of a much wider witch hunt in Great Yarmouth, where 11 people were accused of witchcraft. Once again, Miles Corbett was recorder and sought to prosecute the case against Prynn. However, the water poet John Taylor used the case to castigate Miles Corbett for treating astrology as a demonic menace rather than a con trick. In the 7 years following the initial accusation against Prynn, Great Yarmouth had been transformed by the British Civil Wars. With the collapse of the Church of England, Matthew Brooks was removed and replaced by the Puritan John Brinsley. Puritan towns like Great Yarmouth backed Parliament, and Corbett represented the town in both the short and long parliaments, gaining his reputation as a stiff cathedral hater. Witchcraft accusations over the summer of 1645 came when the town's elite was under strain from economic distress and religious divisions. The impoverishment of Great Yarmouth's fishermen to privateering and the consequent difficulties in collecting taxation and supplying charity undermined the authority of the town's corporation. In February of 1645, members of the corporation ordered the creation of a list of ships lost by the town, since the town and inhabitants are greatly impoverished by losses at sea. The corporation's support for the witch hunt shows how members of the corporation perceived investigating and punishing witchcraft as a means of healing the divisions within Great Yarmouth. The town's magistrates could prove their authority over demonic forces, which for Miles Corbett included Mark Prynn. Now, the poet and wit John Taylor had long been a feature of London life, but the Civil Wars radicalised his writings, leading to a series of political squibs, supporting the king and decrying Parliament. Taylor was a former London waterman, and he had been ill-disposed towards Corbett ever since Corbett and the Lord Mayor of London had arrested and interrogated him for alleged seditious words. This, along with Taylor's subsequent career producing polemical and satirical royalist squibs aimed at parliamentarian hypocrisy, meant that Taylor was keen to challenge Miles Corbett, notably in a satirical speech attributed to Corbett. Taylor attacked Corbett's legal expertise and character, showing how he could make the guiltless guilty, the guilty guiltless. At Parliament, Corbett chaired the committee that prepared a bill against scandalous ministers in 1641, the Committee for Examinations, and the committee that had drawn up charges against Archbishop Laud. Corbett was the ideal target for Taylor. A brief relation of the idiotisms and absurdities of Miles Corbett was an 18-page pamphlet poem written by Taylor that lists 11 idiotisms, of which Corbett's prosecution of Mark Prynn is the 6th. Taylor initially described Corbett's character, his religious views, and allegations of political corruption. Taylor's list of Corbett's idiotisms also described having a dog presented to the sessions and accusing a man of stealing his own goods. Corbett's attack on Mark Prynn provided an example of the recorder's injustice, credulity, and ignorance that Taylor deployed to make the MP look ridiculous and to ridicule the recorder's Puritan faith. Taylor's cynicism regarding astrology was likely a product of the Civil War. During the war, he damned the parliamentarian astrologers for their role in decreeing that Parliament's success had been ordained by the stars. And he had contested parliamentarian almanacs in print. His arguments against Corbett united his campaigns against astrology, his anger at Parliament, and his hatred of Miles Corbett. In 1645, Miles Corbett made a considerable effort to convict Prynn, going further than he had in 1638 to ensure the astrologer's conviction for witchcraft. Taylor alleged that Corbett had personally committed Prynn to jail ahead of the borough sessions and sought evidence of Prynn's guilt for a search of Prynn's study. When the searchers discovered a copy of Molson's Almanac, a book of merry fortune telling with the forms of dice, stars, etc., they brought it to Corbett. According to Taylor, Corbett declared that this is the book the knave doth conjure by. This wicked book shall help him to a check, and at that sessions now will break his neck. This time, however, Prynn was defended by his old friend Matthew Brooks' assistant Thomas Cheshire, who argued that Prynn was a fraud. According to Taylor, Prynn was a juggling, cunning man of fame, a nicknamed conjurer, whose skills in astrology were used many folks to cheat, through his ability to recite the technical terms and jargon of astrology, including fiends and planet, wherefore the country folks admired his art. Now, Thomas Cheshire had suffered contempt and disgrace from the town's Puritan bailiffs and governors. During his time as an assistant minister between 1630 and 1638, members of the town's corporation had accused Cheshire of having lived a debauched and disorderly life, and the leading Puritan alderman Henry Davy accused Cheshire of being a scurvy or salty fellow. Cheshire had allegedly been caught in Yarmouth's narrow rows, the short streets that ran up and down Great Yarmouth, by women and other townsfolk, where they many times jostled him and run their elbows against his back and spit. This campaign of intimidation proved effective, and Cheshire was forced to desist, leaving Great Yarmouth in 1638. His return to speak on behalf of Mark Prynn meant that he was a loud, anti-Puritan voice speaking against Miles Corbett and arguing against the belief that Prynn's astrology had power. Cheshire was attacking Corbett, condemning astrology and Puritan witchcraft beliefs as superstition to denigrate both. Thomas Cheshire defended Prynn by arguing for the mundane nature of Prynn's book collection. Cheshire did the substance of the book did straight explain, as impossible to use for magic, and so appealed to the jury to find Prynn innocent. Taylor said that Cheshire had showed the substance of the book to be as far from Maester Corbett's talk as oatmeal is from eggs or cheese from chalk, because it was insufficient to allow conjuring. As a result, Prynn was found not guilty and escaped a Popham check. Taylor sarcastically remarked that from the trial, the learned recorder gained much credit. Here, Taylor used the failure of the trial and Prynn's fake astrology to undermine Corbett's reputation, in contrast to the educated Cheshire. The 1645 trial of Mark Prynn highlights the point at which three approaches to astrology met and challenged one another. For Prynn and his customers, astrology was part of wider historical and medical knowledge with practical outputs. Despite the second set of accusations against him, Prynn continued to work as an astrologer. However, for Corbett, Prynn's astrological and esoteric knowledge was a sign of his ability to conjure. The almanacs and astrological guides were evidence of a nefarious and demonic purpose. For the satirist John Taylor, Prynn was nothing more than a con man, his knowledge a means of tricking Norfolk rustics of their wealth. In Taylor's eyes, Corbett's credulity was another sign of his backwardness and idiotic nature, his work looking forward to the more cynical takes on witchcraft and ridiculing of witch-finders seen in Samuel Butler's Hudibras. The accusations against Mark Prynn are a dramatic expression of the differing attitudes to astrology seen during the late Caroline period and the British Civil Wars. Despite the two failed accusations against Prynn, he falls from the records. His place in history remains the intersection of various visions of astrology and the controversies it caused. For many residents of Great Yarmouth already reliant on almanacs, Prynn's astrology provided a vital service, able to discover lost items and cure illnesses. During the 1630s, witchcraft became an active part of the political discourse, used as a means of criticizing Charles I's church. Astrology, a white magic with connection to the court, became a major target for Puritan reformers who reinterpreted it as a dangerous form of magic. In Great Yarmouth, the recorder Miles Corbet repeatedly attacks Prynn in court for conjuring, tying Prynn's esoteric knowledge to the summoning of demons. John Taylor's repudiation of Corbett's allegations by arguing that Prynn's astrological knowledge John Taylor's repudiation of Corbett's allegations by arguing that Prynn's astrological ability was merely a fakery demonstrated that Corbett was ill-educated and a fool. By rejecting Corbett's allegations as fantasy, Taylor also rejected the Puritans' claim to powerful witches and their ability to exercise the community. The cultural debate over astrology had become part of the wider battle for England's soul in the middle of the 17th century and prefigured the growing cynicism of the Restoration. Thank you very much.